Welcome to your weekly morning show program. Violence against women and girls remains the most pervasive human rights violation around the world. Already hidden by the COVID-19 pandemic, its prevalence is now being further increased by the intersecting crisis of climate change, global conflict and economic instability. Luckily, the UN leads a 16-day campaign that encourages everyone to get involved, from amplifying the voices of survivors and activists to supporting women's organizations and strengthening feminist movements, to all act to empower survivors, reduce and prevent violence against women and girls, and protect women's rights. Miriam Ziyan has more with her guest this morning. Good morning, Miriam.
Good morning, Melissa. Good morning, dear viewers. Today we chose to talk about violence against women, since we are in the 16 days of the campaign against the violence against women. Violence against women affects women in every corner of the world. It impacts women's health, hampers their ability to participate fully in society, and is a source of tremendous physical and psychological suffering for both women and their families. This is why today we're having with us Dr. Anna Hopkins, a lecturer in criminology, psychology, and domestic violence. Good morning, Dr. Anna.
Good morning.
Now we can hear you clearly. Thank you for accepting our invite, Dr. Anna. I'd like to begin with this. A recent UN report has shown that 5 women were killed every hour during the last year by their family members or partners. Dr. Anna, what causes gender-based violence, in your opinion, and according to your expertise?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's important to kind of be really clear when we talk about gender-based violence that this is a predominantly violence against women and girls perpetrated by men. And I think when we talk about gender-based violence, we also need to be really clear that we're talking about a collection of men who commit what we call femicide, the murder of women, for different motivations. So we have uncles and fathers committing femicide under the kind of causes of honour-based violence when they think shame has been brought onto their family. We have sons killing mothers, often because of mental health issues. But the vast majority are intimate partners or ex-intimate partners who commit murder because they feel they've lost control, because they can't cope with the woman leaving them. So there is a different kind of motivations for this to occur. And I think it's also important when we think about why this is happening, it's important to look at what the perpetrator is doing and has done, and not ever to look at what the victim has done and anything about her behaviour. Murder is something that no behaviour can cause. And when we look at why kind of men commit this act, there are a variety of reasons that could contribute towards it. It could be due to a violent upbringing. It could be due to alcohol or drugs issues. It could be sometimes economics is seen to be a contributing factor, and often it's due to severe mental health from the perpetrator.
So, talking about the causes and reasons of this gender-based violence, I would like to clarify, maybe you can tell us about what are the red flag behaviors of domestic violence.
The biggest red flag in terms of behaviours in domestic violence is what we call coercive and controlling behaviour. That sits at the kind of core of all domestic violence, particularly with intimate partner violence, so boyfriends, husbands, etc. And that's the red flag for that is often seen as one of the beginning points. And it's something that in the UK we've now have a legislation against, where the police can criminalise somebody for displaying this kind of behaviour. And when we talk about coercive and controlling behaviour, we mean stopping the woman from seeing her friends, her family, controlling what she wears, controlling what she does on her telephone, controlling where she can go, controlling what she can say. Not having the dinner ready at a certain time, not being able to go anywhere after work, that kind of thing, which in themselves seem to be quite small things that aren't that important. But actually, when you put that together, that is something that's extremely powerful also for to be able to control the woman to do what that the man wants her to do. And we need to really shift away from just looking at the physical violence and the traditional kind of black eye that we how we view domestic violence victims, to looking more at this deeply disturbing psychological behavior that is really forms the kind of core of how a man is able to have such control of a woman for such a long period of time often.
Exactly. So the violence is not just physical, it could be psychological, it could be financial, it could be economic violence, it could be many types. Now, about the perpetrators, what do you think perpetrators need help? Because we talk a lot about women abused, but what about the perpetrators? Do they need help?
Yes, they need a lot of help. They need to be supported. I mean, women who are abused, they often want help with the perpetrator. They often don't want the perpetrator to be criminalised. They want the perpetrator to get help with anger management, with drug and alcohol issues. And there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done, and we need money to do that. And that's always the problem in this area. There's never enough money to really look at this problem properly. And I think more needs to be done before they become the perpetrators. So when we look at prevention in schools, when we see boys who are displaying problematic behaviour, to try and do something at that point, to try and address that before they go on to be adult perpetrators, to look at what's going on in their family background, to look at what are the causes of this young boy showing these problematic behaviours, because at that point we can create a change, and we can possibly look at reducing that type of behaviour. Whereas when they are adult perpetrators, it's very, very difficult to stop something that's become quite ingrained in that person.
Exactly. Now, another question, what are the consequences of violence against women? What are the consequences we know?
The consequences are horrific for women who have been victims of domestic abuse. And I think, they lose their jobs, they have horrific physical injuries that prevent them from working or prevent them from wanting to leave their houses. And I think the biggest one that we're really starting to look at in the UK here and pay attention to is suicide. In the UK, 30 women a week will take their own lives and commit suicide because of being a victim of domestic violence. And that is something that we need to create more of a link with, is linking not just how many women have been murdered, but also how many women take their own lives as a result of really not having any other options. They've sought the help, it hasn't been successful, they continue to be hugely controlled by their men, and they take their own lives as that's the only way out of this horrific problem. In France, we're now starting to see laws where men are being fined if there seems to be a link with the woman who takes her own life and the perpetrator, and they can also be imprisoned. And I think when we look at consequences, that is by far the biggest consequence of domestic violence. I mean, and the ripple effect goes on. If you look at children who are affected by domestic violence, family members who are affected by domestic homicide, it's absolutely horrific, and it comes at a cost psychologically, but also from an economic point of view. So we need to look at these consequences in a much more serious way.
Now, we have already maybe talked about the fact that there are types of violence. I would like you to clarify, maybe to tell us more about what are the existing types of violence against women.
What types of violence? I mean, there's physical violence. There's also obviously sexual violence, and we often see sexual violence and domestic violence in two separate ways. There is a lot of sexual violence within domestic violence. But there's also, as I mentioned before, the psychological abuse, there's the economical abuse, there's a lot of stalking and harassment, particularly in ex-partners who are no longer with the perpetrator. And leaving the perpetrator is something that is often something that we push for as a society. And actually, it's a very dangerous point in a relationship to leave the abuser, and it's often when this kind of stalking and harassment can occur, and stalking has a strong link to the murder of the victim eventually. So there are many types of different abusive behaviours that can take place.
All right, so Dr. Anna Hopkins, since we've talked about the reasons, types and consequences of this horrific phenomenon, what can be done to combat violence against women?
A lot, I think, and a lot hasn't been done and isn't being done. And I think it does boil down to money. We do need to have proper funding. I appreciate kind of from an international point of view, there isn't the same amount of money available. And if you look in the UK, you know, we have some funding that we can put towards domestic violence, and we have charities that support women, and we do a lot of work, but we still are faced with high levels of femicide and suicide rates. And I think what can be done is as society, we can become much more aware of this, which is where this 16 days of activism, which is the international movement, really brings it to the forefront. But 16 days aren't really enough. It should be every day we should be raising awareness because of these high levels that you mentioned at the beginning in the UN report, because of the high levels that we see in other countries. As society, we need to be more comfortable. It used to be seen as a private matter. Now it's seen more as a public matter. But yet, what are we doing as society? We're still not comfortable to intervene, for the intervention to take place. We need to learn to talk about it more. If we see somebody that has been affected by domestic violence, and we all know a victim and a perpetrator of domestic violence because of the levels, so what can we do as individual members of society? And I think that's really, for me, where more work needs to be done, to really equip people to understand this better, to be able to talk about it better, to be able to be more sympathetic to a woman who is suffering from domestic violence. And that can start, again, in schools, in education, from a young age. If we grow up understanding this better and able to intervene more comfortably and better, then I think we can do a lot of work there. And I think there are places where women go, you know, hairdressers, supermarkets, shops, that tend to be, well, not so much now, but, you know, particularly hairdressers, beauty salons, there's a lot of work there to be done in terms of equipping those people who work there to be able to talk about it, to be able to intervene, to be able to signpost to places of support.
That is a very good point. Now, when talking about intervention, are there barriers for those women who try to seek help? As you said, we want to talk about the matter, we want people to know about it and to be familiar with it. It shouldn't be taboo to talk about it. So what are the barriers facing those women trying to seek help?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's still many barriers to women seeking help, because although it's not taboo, it still can be seen as taboo, and it's very difficult for a woman to accept, firstly, that she has become a victim of domestic violence. Many women refuse to accept it because they don't see themselves as the traditional victim of domestic violence, because of maybe they don't have the right injuries, because maybe they don't have the right background. So I think that's the first barrier, is a woman identifying herself as being a victim of domestic violence, identifying that she is in danger. And I think then other barriers evolve around when they do go to the police, because of sometimes a lack of training, a lack of resources, not having enough police officers. They don't have the right interaction with the police officer. They're not able to prosecute the case in the way that they want, or sometimes they're not able to listen to what the victim wants. Often victims go to the police, but they don't want a prosecution. They don't want to go to court. Going to court is another huge barrier for many victims. And what they want when they go to the police is for the perpetrator to be removed, and for them to have that kind of area of safety or period of safety. Sometimes women want to go back to men, and that's, you know, it's a problematic thing to understand, but we need to also be able to help those women who do want to go back for whatever reason. They might have children, or they might have different reasons. So that is a barrier. What's also a barrier is, what are the alternatives? If they report the man, where can they go? Do they have a safe place? Would they be given a house? You know, and again, from an international context, that would be much harder than here in the UK. But here in the UK, even, we have difficulties providing those safe places in terms of providing houses. We have refuges, which are like shelters where women can go, but not everybody wants to go there. And even then, we don't have enough of them to fully support those women. So there are still, unfortunately, a lot of barriers to women seeking help. And I think that then also interacts with people not having enough sympathy for the woman. Well, why doesn't she just leave? Or why doesn't she just report? If a man hit me, I would go. Well, it's really not that simple. And we've all been in relationships where we've made compromises. And this is just a way of sometimes making those compromises. And sometimes that first step to seeking help can be the hardest one because of that not wanting to be in that situation themselves. So there are many barriers still, and we need to work much more at reducing some of those barriers.
We need to work more in order to reduce those barriers for women seeking help. Now, Dr. Hopkins, I'd like to point out that research from several countries have shown that stigma exacerbates the negative effects of violence and is associated with re-victimization as well as reduced likelihood of help seeking. So what can we do in this very specific case, Dr. Hopkins?
In terms of the stigma, we need to work much harder at reducing that stigma and be more accepting of the fact that this is occurring at such high rates, and it's not reducing. Whatever we do, whatever legislation we put in place, it doesn't necessarily reduce it. And I think what's also really important is for men to become involved in reducing this issue. This is a man's problem, and men need to be more active. If you look at the protests, if you look at those who work in these areas, it's always women. Where are the men? Where are the men who say, this is not okay? These are my sisters. These are my friends. These are my mothers. You know, where are they in their voices? We need to see them so much more. We need to get them so much more involved in speaking out, because this is a man's problem, not a woman's problem, and they need to work more to reduce the stigma of this.
I see. Now, women survivors of gender-based violence may withdraw from or fail to demand social support, as we have been saying, because feelings of shame lead them to believe they do not deserve the right support, they do not deserve support. We can see in developed societies that some women are, not just in developed societies, but we can see that some women are more privileged than others. What's your comment on this, Dr. Hopkins?
Sorry, the line is slightly fuzzy. What was the last bit?
Okay, so I said that women survivors of gender-based violence may withdraw or fail from reaching out or to demand social support because of the feeling of shame. It leads them to believe that they do not deserve the right support. We can see in some developed societies, or overall in all societies, that some women are more privileged than others. What's your comment on that?
Yes, I mean, a social class and economics play a role in help seeking amongst domestic violence victims, and we see that in terms of reporting rates. And again, it goes to this stigma. If you have kind of the more to lose, the less likely you will be to seek that help. And that also goes to, if you live in a really big house, you might not be that comfortable with stepping down into a shared space with other women. And it's again also about that identification. We see it as something that happens to those who are less fortunate, those who might have economic issues, but actually it occurs across the whole sector of society. Whether you are, you know, whatever colour you are, whatever income you have, men will commit violence against women, regardless of their status in society.
Now, Dr. Hopkins, since countries treat the same phenomenon differently in legal system, we can say that they usually fail to address this when it comes to case of violence and sexual assault. What can we collectively do to fight against this epidemic?
it's an interesting question. If you look at the kind of failures in the legal system in the UK, a lot of the cases are not prosecuted, but that's because a lot of victims don't want to engage with the criminal justice system. So I think it's about looking at and listening more to what women want. We have different ways of dealing with domestic violence. We have different interventions that we can put into place. And, you know, from an international context, there are many different ways in which this issue is dealt with. And I think it is important to come together collectively and share ways in which these effective ways are put into place, and to understand what is happening across different countries. Like I mentioned in France, you know, they are making progress with dealing with suicide in a better way. And I think from a UK point of view, we have a lot of legislation. We've had a big increase in legislation, yet it's not making the difference that it should. So why is that? Why is it that we're not using these things? And part of that problem is you can increase the legislation, but if you don't train police officers who are giving the orders, the prohibition things, then they won't be able to use them effectively. And again, you need to then ensure that you have, with this increased legislation, proper police training for them to really understand what it is that they are able to do, the different measures that they have available to them.
So thank you, Dr. Anna. We understood more work needs to be done at the international level and everywhere in the world. Thank you for joining Now 24 News morning show. Thank you so much.